Another grand jury member, Lloyd Mayhew, said there was definitely a cover-up. We had been used. We were all madder than hell that we couldn't subpoena anyone we wanted. Our hands were tied. So many things bother me. They still do. One of them is that within 100 yards of the Dyke Bridge is a summer cottage. The lights were on and there was a phone. Kennedy walked right by it. I don't know what kind of man would do that. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jessica Nell, and if you're new, then I would like to welcome you. I want you to know that I realize you could spend your time lots of different ways, and I appreciate that you hang out here with me and want to read good books and learn more about, right now, the Kennedy family. So I don't take it lightly if you choose to subscribe. I'm very grateful for that. And because of you, I get to read great books. Otherwise, I'd have to be spending my time like door dashing or something else. And instead, I get to read good books with you and talk about them. And I love that. So right now we're going through the Kennedy men, 3 generations of sex, scandal, and secrets. And our story has shifted from Joe to Jack to Bobby, and now we're on to Teddy. And in our last episodes, we read through the early part of Teddy's political career, and then we spent time going through a Life magazine that showed his recovery from an airplane crash that happened in 1965, and that was very fascinating. So actually the plane crash happened in 1964, I believe, and his recovery was in 1965. But now we are reading chapter 13 in our book. It's about the story that came to be synonymous with Teddy Kennedy. It's called CHAPPAQUIDDIck. And I just want to let you know from the outset that we actually last fall read an entire book called CHAPPAQUIDDIck by Leo D'Amour. Very fascinating, excellent book. So if you are looking for unfortunately, it's kind of an ironic word to use, but a deep dive into this whole incident that we're going to talk about today, that playlist is a fascinating read through because we went piece by piece through the evidence and got a really great look at that case. But this will be a nice overview, and we do get a bit of a different angle on it. So let's settle in and read it together. I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident immediately, said Teddy Kennedy in 1969. And I just say, well, good, then we're all in agreement. It is indefensible. The next little quote at the top of this chapter is from a letter to Time magazine written on August 15th, 1969, by a man named Gordon N. Walker. Listen to this. It says, I ask you to consider what would happen to a private citizen who, heading out to the dunes after a party with a girl in his car, drove off the road and killed the girl, and then crept quietly away from the scene without saying anything to anyone, leaving car and corpse to be discovered the next day without his assistance. The laws covering a situation like this are stringent, nay, merciless. Such a private citizen would pay a very stiff price indeed for his irresponsible behavior. Yet it seems that Edward Kennedy intends to pay no price at all. And then a very damning quote from, again, Teddy Kennedy, this time in 1973. He asked, do we operate under a system of equal justice under law? Or is there one system for the average citizen and another for the high and mighty? It's a question with such hubris and such meaning. Well, the weekend of July 18th and 19th, 1969 was planned as a reunion of the Boiler Room Girls, the young women who had served Bobby Kennedy by reaching out to delegates to try to beef up his campaign strength and to keep track of how many delegates he would have at the Democratic National Convention that was coming shortly after his California primary that he won, but sadly had been assassinated the evening that he won that California primary. This incident came 1 year after that assassination. Affectionately known as the Boiler Room Girls, this get-together was meant to be a thanks for their work in Bobby's campaign. Kennedy cousin Joe Gargan had been the one to primarily plan it. He reserved rooms for the women at the Katama Shores Inn near Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard. Teddy and the men would be put up at the Shiretown Inn in Edgartown. Gargan also rented a small cottage, gray shingled with yellow shutters, on Chappaquddick Island across the channel from Edgartown. There was going to be a cookout and a party after the races. Chappaquddick was a small island, barely 5 miles long and 3 miles wide, and at the height of the summer season, the population did not amount to 500 people. It was accessible from Edgartown only by a ferry, which was really a small flat barge with room for 2 cars and 20 people. The boat operated between 7:30 a.m. and midnight and made the crossing in 4 minutes. The women are listed: Susan Tannenbaum, Esther Newberg, Rosemary Keogh, and Nance Lyons, her sister Mary Ellen Lyons, Mary Jo Kopechne. 6 women and 6 men. The men were Joe Gargan, Paul Markham, Charles Treader, John Crimmins, who was the chauffeur, and then Teddy Kennedy. Now it's missing somebody else also. It's Ray LaRosa. He's not mentioned in this initial thing, but one of the things that was scandalous about this event was that it was 6 men and 6 women, all of them unmarried, all of them in their 20s. Many of the men were married, and obviously Teddy Kennedy was a senator. So amidst the news of this shocking information that a young lady had passed away in Ted Kennedy's vehicle, came this seedy, what was it? Why were they hanging out? How are 6 men and 6 women on an island together in a cottage and it's not inappropriate? Come on. How naive do you think we all are? Apparently, actually, through this book, it did seem that many more people were invited, and it wasn't necessarily going to be 6 and 6. So it's not like there was a matchup of, we know these 6 and these 6, and they're, all matched up as couples. It wasn't like that. So even though it was looking inappropriate, and even though there may have been some hanky-panky going on with various members, that also is reported in the book, it was not just a 6 and 6 matchup and totally tawdry from the start. They were supposed to get together for a day of swimming and watching Teddy compete, and then at 8:30, the group gathered at the cottage on Chappaquddick for an outdoor barbecue and drinking. According to Ted, it was around 11:15 or 11:30 that he glanced at his watch, remarked he was tired, and when he said he was going to go catch the ferry, Mary Jo Kopechne asked for a lift. So Teddy gets his car keys, and the two climb into the Oldsmobile. That's the official story. About half a mile away, Teddy takes a wrong turn, and instead of heading for the ferry, which would be curving around to the left, very obviously on an island where Teddy had been many times, inexplicably, he turns to the right, ends up on a dirt and sand road that leads down to Dyke Bridge. Dyke Bridge is at a particular angle that's from this road. They were going too fast. That's where the car goes off the bridge and into Poocha Pond. Teddy survived. Mary Jo Kopechne did not. There are many questions surrounding the vehicle. One of them is whether or not Ted was even in the car at all. Again, I'm going to point you to that playlist if you want to go deep into this, but we're just going to read what Nellie Bly tells us about it. Teddy would later testify under oath that he remembered the Oldsmobile going off Dyke Bridge, and the next thing he recalled was Mary Jo's movement beside him, struggling, perhaps hitting or kicking me, and I, at this time, opened my eyes and realized I was upside down, that water was crashing in on me, that it was pitch black. According to Ted, the strong current swept him to the bank. There really was a current. Even accomplished swimmers had difficulty retaining their position in the water because of the strong tidal pull that goes into and out of that tidal pool area that's called Poocha Pond. He apparently called Mary Jo's name several times. Not getting any response, he swam back to the submerged car and tried 7 or 8 times to reach her. I was fully aware that I was trying to get the girl out of that car, and I was fully aware that I was doing everything that I possibly could to get her out of that car. And I was fully aware at that time that my head was throbbing and my neck was aching and I was breathless. And at that time, the last, hopelessly exhausted. Giving up, Teddy said he managed to walk back to the cottage more than a mile away. That would have taken him about 15 to 20 minutes, he claimed, and he saw no people, houses, or lights along the way. Hold that thought. Outside the cottage, he encountered Ray LaRosa and asked him to get Gargan and Markham. There's been a terrible accident, he told the 2 men. We've got to go. It's claimed that Gargan then drove the threesome to Dyke Bridge, where he later testified he and Markham stripped and dove repeatedly down into the water to try to reach Mary Jo. They too experienced the current. Now, Markham actually had been drinking, and so he was basically useless. So they too give up and told Teddy they would have to report the accident. One of the things that I loved about this book, Chappaquiddick, is that Joey Gargan is a primary source to Leo D'Amour for that book. So you're getting firsthand information from Joey Gargan for that book. So again, another plug for it because it really helped give a very robust understanding of that entire situation and the various sides of what may have actually happened. Kennedy testified that he told the 2 men, "You take care of the other girls, I will take care of the accident," then swam across the 500-foot wide Martha's Vineyard Channel to the mainland, making his way through the deserted streets to the Shiretown Inn at 2 a.m., where he removed his wet clothing and fell asleep on the bed. Of course, there's questions about how could he swim. We all saw the back brace. We understand his physical form and that it would have been difficult to make this swim. Others tried it and were able to make the swim. So there was skepticism, and yet there's reason to think, well, some of this could have been truthful. However the case, he got across for sure. A half hour later, Teddy appeared in the lobby, dressed in a blazer and slacks, and spoke to Russell Peachy, the co-owner of the inn, to ask about the time and to complain about the noise from a party at the motel next door. The manager told him it was 2:25 a.m., but listen to this quote of his description. He says, "He didn't look to me like a man who had come downstairs to complain about the noise. Usually a man who just wants to complain about noise doesn't get up and get fully dressed to do it, especially at 2:25 in the morning." Yeah. Well, around 7 a.m., Teddy reappears in the lobby, freshly shaven and wearing yachting clothes. To the clerk, he appeared normal in every way. He asked for a dime to make a phone call, explaining, "I seem to have left my wallet upstairs." He walks out to the outside porch, and then instead of using the dime, he places a collect call to Helga Wagner, a longtime girlfriend that he had. We do have a photo of her, so I'll go ahead and show that to you. Some people said she was the love of his life. But there's Helga Wagner, really a beautiful woman, incredibly pretty. Teddy told her that something very serious had happened, and he needed a phone number where he could reach Stephen Smith, who was with his wife Jean, who was Teddy's sister, vacationing in Spain. After getting the number, he returned the dime to the desk clerk. When Gargan and Markham got to the Shiretown Inn the next morning, they learned that Teddy had still not reported the accident. They again advised him to call the authorities, but he wanted to contact Burke Marshall, an attorney. He could not reach him. So by 9 a.m., the 3 men were on the ferry back to Chappaquiddick. On arrival, they proceeded immediately to a shack about 100 feet from the dock, where Teddy, using his credit card, began a series of long-distance calls from the payphone inside. He would eventually make a total of 17 telephone calls before reporting the accident to the police. At 9:30 a.m., Teddy had finished his calls and was standing outside when, listen to this, Tony Betancourt, a year-round resident of Chappaquiddick, approached him. "Senator, do you know there's a dead girl found in your car?" The senator stared at him and said nothing. Betancourt offered him a ride to the bridge, but the senator told him he was going over to town. This puzzled Betancourt, who had been sent by the Edgartown police chief to await the arrival of the medical examiner on the ferry. Police Chief Dominic Arena had been summoned to Chappaquiddick earlier that morning by a phone call reporting that 2 fishermen had seen the overturned Oldsmobile near the narrow wooden bridge that led to the private beach. At the scene at 8:25, Arena had radioed for a diver, and John Farrar, captain of the department's scuba search and rescue division, arrived 20 minutes later, already donned in his scuba gear, and descended down into the water. Farrar quickly found the body of Mary Jo in the overturned car, her hands clasping the back seat, her face turned upward to the footwell above her. This is one of the facts that became abundantly clear of her position. And because she was in rigor mortis, it was very clear that she was grasping the seat in front of her. Her feet appeared to be pushing her upward so that her face could turn into the footwell, presumably to get the last little bits of air. It looked as if she were holding herself up to get a last breath of air, Farrar told People magazine. It was a consciously assumed position. Farrar believed that the car had contained an air pocket and that Mary Jo lived for at least 2 hours down there. Tying a rope around her waist, he and Arena hauled her body to the surface. While in the water, Arena had obtained the license plate number of the car, and when he had the ownership checked, he found it was registered in Senator Kennedy's name. So as Mary Jo's body is pulled out, he's searching the face, going, do I recognize this girl? Is she a Kennedy? Everybody, of course, it sounds grotesque, as if he's like a respecter of persons. And I think actually, as you go through the story, you find that he kind of was. But I actually think in that moment, he, like the rest of the country, recognized the Kennedys have already been through so much. Please don't let it be another loss of a child. So I think there's mercy in there, even if it does sound like sort of like a respecter of persons or, fear of man sort of response. I think actually there's some like humanity in that, of just like, she's already lost 2 daughters really because of Rosemary's absence from the family in person, and now 3 sons. Please don't let it be another Kennedy child. Kennedy and his 2 companions ferried back to Edgartown, where Teddy headed for the police station. Well, this is not actually true. Gargan stayed on the island to help clean up the cottage. Markham and Ted went to the police station. So I'm finding, just based on my research, there is definitely falsehood here. It's not intentional, it's just a little bit careless. Saying nothing about the accident involving his car, Teddy walked into the police station and asked the officer on duty if he might use the telephone. Recognizing him and wanting to treat him with appropriate respect, the woman in the office directs him to the chief's office where he could make his calls in privacy. So he's given, credit, even though he's actually misleading by even being there and not mentioning, hey, by the way, I and my vehicle were involved in a fatal car crash last night. When Chief Arena learned that Teddy was at the station, he returned there. He was still in his wet bathing suit and the t-shirt that he had been wearing while diving into the water to see if there was a body in the submerged car. Arena recalled it this way. It's so ironic, such a borderline creepy picture. The senator was in clean, dry clothes, poised, confident, and in control, using my office and telephone. And I'm standing in a puddle of water in a state of confusion. This is a man who has literally been in the water, trying to dive down, exhausted himself and his own body before he gives up, sits on top of the vehicle, asks somebody to call for the search and rescue. They come, he's a part of it. They find out that it's Ed's vehicle. They find out that she is not a Kennedy, but they don't quite know who she is. They actually misidentify her at first. And he's standing there now. He's the one who's wet. He's the one who's come from the vehicle. And the person who was the driver of the vehicle is behind his desk dry. It's a complete reversal from what it ought to be. Very odd. Irina found it hard to believe that the senator had been in a major automobile accident. His face bore no marks. He never indicated any physical discomfort. If he had been injured or in shock or confused, nothing of it lingered in our meeting to my observation, said Irina. Meanwhile, Gargan and Markham had returned to the cottage, where the party guests that's also not true. I have to stop right there. Markham stayed with Ted at the chief's office the whole time. He helped him draft his first statement, his physical written statement about the car accident, while Gargan was already back at the cottage. So Gargan had already returned to the cottage. Having missed the last ferry, the party guests had all just slept there for the night. And so they tell the girls nothing about the accident. The boiler room girls go back to their hotel. Now, we use this word girls, the boiler room girls. It's they're used throughout the book. They're all like in their late 20s. None of them are girls. So it's just a common term of the age. It is moderately offensive. It does, I think, come from the boiler room girls, but it does give indication to how they were seen. They were not treated as equals. They were not treated as obviously worthy of knowing this information that their friend had just died. The information that other people are in possession of, they are not given. Nancy Lyons later said, "We were fully expecting to find Miss Kopechne waiting for us at the hotel. They still thought, oh, she must have made it off the island with Ted, but she wasn't. And we waited." One call that Teddy made from the police station was to Mary Jo's parents. "I was alone," Gwen Kopechne said later. "I think he said something about her being in an accident." "Is she dead?" I screamed. He hesitated, but he had to say yes. From then on, I don't remember anything. Neighbors rushed into the house when they heard her anguished cries. Next, Teddy called his own mother. She had been about to leave for an event, but she cancels that appearance. And he called Joan, his wife, last of all. Remember, he called his girlfriend, the lawyers, he calls everybody, but the girls and the wife are the last people to get told. Then he had to tell his father, so I guess Joe is the last. He heads for Hyannisport. Ted does. He leaves the police station after giving a really ridiculous statement. Rita Dallas, Joe's nurse after his stroke, recalled that day. We read this account, if you're interested. It's the Kennedy case by Rita Dallas, and I read the 4 different accounts of Jack Kennedy, his assassination, Bobby Kennedy, when he told that he was going to run for president, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, and then I believe the 4th episode that we did in that series was this whole account of Chappaquiddick. So if you're interested in this account of what Hyannisport was like, that's an angle that's very interesting to hear. Rita Dallas recalled that day when he came to his father's bedside. She said he appeared drawn and downcast. Placing a hand on the old man's shoulder, he said, "Dad, I'm in some trouble. There's been an accident, and you're going to hear all sorts of things about me from now. Terrible things. But Dad, I want you to know that they're not true. It was an accident." Bedridden since his stroke, Joe Kennedy closed his eyes as Ted explained how he left the scene of an accident and left a girl to drown. 4 months later, Joe was dead. A lot of people point to this as the thing that kind of did take the spark out of Joe, that even though he had had a stroke, that we saw in our Life magazine, for example, that he's walking beside Teddy in the pool, that there were things where he was exercising his body and his mind, even if he couldn't speak, but that this sort of like took his spirit and he gave up after this. Well, everyone returns back to Hyannisport. Even Jackie comes from Greece. Rita Dallas, the eyewitness at that gathering, recalls that Rose was so upset that she couldn't speak. She took Teddy outside near the flagpole so that they could have absolute privacy. Rose, of all of them, must have recognized the death of the dream the dynasty that we talked about from the beginning of this book that they had set out together. We're going to raise the older ones right, so the younger ones follow their lead. We're going to have 4 presidents, Joe said at one point to a colleague or a friend. We're going to have 4 presidents, and then later there's going to be 3 of them. This is the death of the dynasty. CBS News reporter Ed Joyce was on nearby Martha's Vineyard when he received a call from the news desk. Joyce took the ferry to Chappaquiddick, drove to Dyke Bridge, and parked his car, noting skid and splinter marks on the bridge. He began knocking on doors of the houses of Dyke Road that led to the bridge, and from these neighbors he learns about the party and is directed to the house. He already has done more investigative work than the police. He already is multiple steps ahead of where the police are. Chief Arena had been telling reporters all day that he was convinced that the accident was strictly accidental and that there doesn't appear from the principal evidence to be any excessive speed here. After a short conference with Joyce, however, Arena begins to have doubts. He realizes the nearly 8-hour time lag between the accident and the time that it was reported to the police may have actually gone somewhat differently than what the senator had explained. Senator Kennedy was already gone. The evidence is already off the island by the time that Arena even learns that there was a party the night before. Joyce had measured the distance between the scene of the accident and the cottage as 1 mile and 2/10, and he noted it would have taken the senator past several houses, one of whose occupants told Joyce that her lights had been on the night before. Joyce went on to ask, who were the friends? Were they aware of what had happened to Mary Jo? And how was Senator Kennedy able to recross the 1/8 of a mile of water from Chappaquiddick to Edgartown when the ferry was not running? None of these questions had yet been asked by Chief Arena. Joyce's prodding encouraged Chief Arena to re-examine the senator's story, and he began to acknowledge that there were serious gaps. The following mornings on Sunday, Arena filed a citation against the senator for leaving the scene of the accident. Joyce was the only reporter who had located the cottage or suggested that there were holes in Teddy's story. Most of the others, including the New York Times, had relied almost completely on the statement that Teddy had given. It had always been that way for Kennedy men. From Jack's heroism on the PT-109, Rosemary's disability, Jack's health, the philandering of all the Kennedy men, and more. There's so many instances of stories being twisted, adjusted, disappearing, or appearing based on the whims of the Kennedy men. One of the few who did not ignore the story was this man, Ed Joyce. Sunday morning, he returns to the cottage to have a closer look, and the entire area had been sanitized. Joyce spoke to the cottage caretaker who lived next door, and they told him that although they did not see the partygoers, they had certainly heard them. The dogs had barked all night because of the singing and the laughter. The party wasn't wild, but they were very loud, and if they had kept it up, I would have called the police. At 1 o'clock, I was pretty fed up with the whole thing, but sometime between 1:30 and 2, the noise suddenly died down. She leaves us with this statement that is interesting. More than 2 hours after Ted said he had left for the ferry, the party suddenly ended. We were told that Mary Jo Kopechne might have lived for 2 hours. We get a sense in the book that perhaps the order of events was not what was claimed. It's very interesting that all of a sudden the party dies down around 2. At Hyannisport, the Kennedy machine went to work. Suddenly, the big wigs are called in. Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, is there. Kennedy's speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, was there. Burke Marshall, Steve Smith, Dave Burke, Paul Markham, Joe Gargan. It's a long list of all men, of course. So Teddy and his advisors move into damage control. Yes, a young woman was dead, but everyone present agreed the most important thing they could do was salvage Teddy's career. No Kennedy woman was included in these intense discussions, not even Teddy's wife. One friend pointed out, Joan stayed upstairs in her bedroom almost the entire time, excluded from taking any part in decisions that would shape the future course of her marriage and the rest of her life. Joan later put it this way: I was told to stay upstairs in my bedroom. Downstairs, the house was full of people, aides, friends, lawyers. Ted called his girlfriend Helga before he or anyone else told me what was going on. It was the worst experience of my life. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. No one told me anything. And when I picked up the extension phone, I could hear Ted talking to Helga. Nothing ever seemed the same after that. No, it wouldn't, would it? You wouldn't be able to see your husband the same. You wouldn't be able to see the Kennedy machine the same way. You wouldn't be able to see your life the same way. It wouldn't feel like your own life. 10 hours after he told the ambassador what he had done, a well-coached Teddy appeared on national television from his father's home in Hyannisport. He gave a prepared version of what had supposedly happened, speaking for 17 minutes. If you haven't seen it, you should go and look up a video. They're on YouTube. You can definitely watch it, and you'll get a sense of, you can make your own determination of his truthfulness, of what he's reading, of what he actually means. Does he mean any of it? Take a look and make your own determination. In that talk, he denied the widely circulated suspicions of immoral conduct that have been leveled at my behavior and hers regarding that evening. He also denied that he had been drinking heavily, and he apologized for his failure to report the accident. Teddy concluded by asking Massachusetts voters whether or not they thought he should resign from the Senate. The next morning, 7,500 telegrams arrived at his home. Another 7,500 were in the Western Union office. Within a week, there were more than 100,000 letters, cards, and calls, most of them telling Kennedy to keep his seat in the Senate. The following Friday, he goes for the funeral. He wears a neck brace. It had been decided that Joan should accompany him to play the role of the loyal Kennedy wife. She says it was a terrible experience and the beginning of the end for Ted and me. Teddy then returned to Edgartown to plead guilty to leaving the scene of an accident, and Judge Boyle gave him a 2-month suspended sentence. The following January, an inquest was held where 28 witnesses were heard during a 4-day proceeding. Those proceedings were closed at the request of the Kennedy lawyers. John Farrar testified at the inquest that he could have had Mary Jo out of the car alive in 25 minutes if he had been called immediately. 4 months later, the 763-page transcript was released, in which Boyle concluded that negligent driving appears to have contributed to the death of Mary Jo CHAPPAQUIDDIck. Under inquest law, Judge Boyle could have ordered Senator Kennedy's arrest, but he chose not to do so. The DA chose not to seek the manslaughter indictment that such a finding might have supported. The next day, Judge Boyle retired from the bench. The senator's chief counsel, Edward Hannafy, purchased Kennedy's Oldsmobile from the insurance company and had the car crushed, destroying all evidence. In the immediate aftermath, Joan Kennedy suffered her 3rd miscarriage, and in the following months, old Joe sank rapidly. By the fall, it was clear that the end was near. The family gathered around him, and on the evening of November 8, 1969, the ambassador passed away at 81, his dynastic dream in ruins. I just want to point out this is another place where Nellie Bly has reversed the sections and their order. Joe passed away before the inquest. In November is his death, January is the inquest. But Teddy read a tribute at the funeral that had been written by his brother Bobby in 1965 that was for his father, and it's insightful. He says, "He has called on the best that was in us. There was no such thing as half trying. Whether it was running a race or catching a football, competing in school, we were to try. And we were to try harder than anyone else. We might not be the best, and none of us were, but we were to make the effort to be the best." Now we go back to the grand jury. At least one member of the Dukes County grand jury was left with a feeling that justice had not been done. Its members had been pressured by the judge to drop the case. I think we were manipulated, Lester Leland, who is a local pharmacist and the foreman of the grand jury, said. He said, I think we were blocked from doing our job, and if you want to use the word cover-up, then okay, that's what it was. The grand jury sought to subpoena key witnesses, including the women who had attended the party, but District Attorney Denise told us that we couldn't subpoena them because they'd already testified at the inquest. The truth is that a grand jury is legally empowered to subpoena anyone it wants, but the grand jury was not even permitted to see the transcript of the witnesses' testimony at the inquest. So because it was in the inquest and then it had been sealed, those testimonies were seen as they've already been given and you can't see them. So the grand jurors on this grand jury trial were given no evidence. Another grand jury member, Lloyd Mayhew, said there was definitely a cover-up. We had been used. We were all madder than hell that we couldn't subpoena anyone we wanted. Our hands were tied. So many things bother me. They still do. One of them is that within 100 yards of the Dyke Bridge is a summer cottage. The lights were on and there was a phone. Kennedy walked right by it. I don't know what kind of man would do that. There is little doubt that Teddy's failure to seek help immediately cost Mary Jo Kopechne her life. If he had reported the accident at once instead of waiting 10 hours, Mary Jo might still be alive. Even now, this is true. I did the math. She would only be 84 right now. I have relatives who are in their 90s. So, it's possible that she could have had a long, wonderful life. And that's the injustice of these moments. That's the things that we have to retain if we're going to weigh these things properly. That's what these grand jurors were feeling, is there's a real young woman who was breathing and now she's not. She was living and pursuing her dreams and her career and having important relationships with her family and friends, and now she's not. And that is a tragedy. Ted Kennedy is not the main character of this story. Mary Jo Kopechne is, and her life was taken. For the 6 months following the accident, Gwen Kopechne submerged her pain in Valium. It was years before she could even speak about the tragedy. Interestingly, I have never read the strong language that is quoted here. And I really want to go find the 2 articles that are quoted here because I think it could be valuable to read. I didn't realize these existed. These quotes from her were not fully included in Chappaquiddick, and they were also not included in Ask Not. So I would have thought they would be one or both places, but I've never heard some of these things. So listen to these comments. Jo Kopechne said he was worried about himself, not about Mary Jo. And equally hurtful and confusing to the parents was the fact that no one else who was at the party has said anything to explain how their only daughter died. Mrs. Kopechne said the following: I'm angry at every one of those girls. They should try to explain. Somebody is hiding something. I think all of them were shut up. I think there was a big cover-up and that everybody was paid off. The hearing, the inquest, it was all a farce. The Kennedys had the upper hand, and it's been that way ever since. I can't believe these articles were not highlighted in either of those. Now, some of these I think may have been given after Leo D'Amour's book, but both of them are well before the Ask Not book was written. So I'm surprised they weren't listed. The Kopechnes refused to allow an autopsy, which is an issue. She couldn't bear the thought of people messing with her daughter, but I do think she had one tool at her disposal, which would be let the truth be found out through whatever can be learned from her physical body. And that was withheld from being an option. Even when appeals were made after the fact, she still would not allow it. They chose to bring no legal action against Ted for the death of their only child. Jo Kopechne said, "We figured people would think we were looking for blood money. They did receive $90,000 from Teddy as a settlement and another $50,000 from his insurance company. And they used part of the money to build a hilltop house not far from where their daughter is buried. We're told at the time of this book, which I'll remind you was written in 1996, they frequently visit her grave to leave flowers and remain unsatisfied about the case. I don't believe anything I've heard so far, Mrs. CHAPPAQUIDDIck said. I want him to tell me what happened. Can't he relieve us of this? Isn't there something he could tell me that would lift this heavy, heavy burden from my heart? Golly, do you hear this appeal? Her daughter died in 1969. This book is written in 1996. The articles were written in 89. So 20 years after the fact, she's still saying, isn't there something he could tell me that would lift this heavy, heavy burden from my heart? You can just hear her sorrow. Just tell me what happened. Get it over with. Let me know. Let me put this thing to rest. And she never gets the call. Teddy died in 2009 without having ever unburdened himself to her parents. In the years since the drowning death of Mary Jo, her parents have heard almost nothing from the senator. Listen to this quote from Gwen CHAPPAQUIDDIck. She says, the only time we hear from him is if something's going to happen with him. We get a phone call just to find out how bitter we are and whether we're going to be cooperative. So she saw right through him. Neither of the CHAPPAQUIDDICks doubted that their daughter's death had kept the senator from ever becoming president. And the questions still linger. Why was the senator driving at midnight with a young single woman? Was he drunk? Was he speeding? Why didn't he call the police immediately? The senator has never explained how he could have mistakenly taken a sharp right turn off the island's only paved road onto a dirt road. He has never explained why he walked past 4 houses without bothering to call for help. He's never explained why he put on dry clothes and chatted with the clerk at his Edgartown motel at 2 a.m. If at this point in his life Teddy considered giving up the fight, which reports are that he did, that he was very despondent during that time in Hyannisport, it was not to be. Rose put her foot down, hard. Teddy was told that he was to carry on, like it or not. In their minds, the dynasty had been saved. In reality, however, the sheen was gone. There would be no more Kennedy presidencies. There would be no more dynasty from the original 4 men. Teddy would, by some accounts, go on to become the lion of the Senate, to do certain things in government, but he never did regain the footing that he possessed prior to Chappaquiddick. This is the story of Chappaquiddick. I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to point you in the direction of that Chappaquiddick playlist and also that Rita Dallas discussion of what happened in Hyannisport from her perspective during the events during that weekend. So I want to hear from you in the comments, and I can't wait to see you next time. Have a great day. Bye.